And you are a citizen, I believe you were born in South Africa? Is that correct?
I was born in Israel. I grew
Oh.
up in South Africa,
Wow.
and I recently became a New Zealand citizen.
Wow. So that's so interesting. It is, here's me, Miss American, et cetera. So it's very interesting, to meet you. And so you are, back home for a short while, I guess. Where do you reside, in general when you're not filmmaking, if that ever occurs?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm kind of in a state of flux at the moment. My next destination will be Uruguay because I want to go there to make, to film the documentary there, the sequel, because they are the first country in the world to fully legalize cannabis on a national scale. So although I mentioned earlier that cannabis is legal in North Korea, they don't actually have a regulatory framework for it. So there's just no laws against it. But in Uruguay, there are laws to structure its production and distribution, and in fact, the government itself is the distributor of cannabis. So it's a very interesting test case for other countries to follow. And they're experiencing very positive results. They're getting revenue from it, which is the main benefit from legalizing it, because currently all of the profits go to the black market. When you regulate it, as they've done in Colorado, there's an enormous boon in terms of the taxes that you can levy on it, and also in terms of employment, because you're you're not creating a new industry. You're basically taking an underground industry and now creating a above ground industry, which has benefits in and of itself.
Excellent. And Uruguay, is that Uruguay? How do I say it correctly?
Either way.
Okay.
Uruguay.
Well, now, if I'm not mistaken, they stood up against the UN decision. I believe that was done in 61. The UN. Let's see. I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm looking through my notes.
Convention on Narcotic Drugs.
Yes. Thank you. Would you like to elaborate a little bit about that? And and Uruguay is the first country to stand up against that and just basically say we're not following that, even though the UN imposed that upon their country. They just stood back and just said we're not doing that. So it's very interesting. It can be done. In other words.
Oh yes, I mean the UN conventions. It seems to be that politicians and diplomats will accept certain conventions or certain aspects of certain conventions when it suits them, and when it doesn't, they just reject them. So it's not like the UN can invade Uruguay and force them to follow any of the conventions that they've signed, and the same goes for any country. So the conventions are used by politicians especially in New Zealand, to say, no, we're not going to experiment with our cannabis laws because we are signatories to these international conventions. But the example of Uruguay demonstrates that the conventions can actually be ignored. And when that happened, the UN sent them threatening letters and demanded that they reverse course. And the president of Uruguay at that time, Jose Mujica, just said, no, it's not in our interest to do so, and we're just going to go ahead with the legalization of cannabis. And the UN was completely powerless to stop them. Very interesting. And a great point. Because, Uruguay obviously is not a nation of a lot of means, and would be considered a poor nation, I'm assuming. And for them to stand... Actually, they're quite affluent. Oh. They've got the highest standard of living in South America. Oh, I did not know that. Uruguay is a very successful little nation. They're one of the few countries that didn't suffer an economic collapse back in 2008. They've got a very good agricultural sector. They've got a very progressive constitution. They're actually one of the, in fact, in 2013, The Economist magazine voted them Country of the Year.
Wow. See, I did not know that. So thank you for telling me that. And obviously, they're creating more profit now for their domestic, for the gross domestic product, I should say. Is that the right word? GDP? Yeah. By legalizing and being able to tax marijuana or cannabis. So I'm sure that certainly doesn't hurt their economy.
Oh, no, definitely not. And you save an enormous amount of money by not prohibiting cannabis, because all of the resources that are currently wasted in most of the countries in the world, with the police, with the courts, with the prisons that are, filled up with cannabis users and other drug users, all of that gets allocated towards hospitals and education, and infrastructure. And not only that, but when you're taxing cannabis, you're getting revenue from cannabis instead of wasting all of that money. And also, I don't think that it's a good idea to have, say, developing children consuming a lot of marijuana, aka cannabis. But when one country or one standard happens to where it may be legalized, what happens is you don't have that kind of puts the drug dealer of sorts out of business and tempting the kids early on and getting to them, because it's not taboo and it's not, it's somewhat out in the open. So therefore with the regulation would be a positive effect in not having overuse in the youth. Oh, absolutely. In the case of the Netherlands, where it's been de facto legal at the point of sale since the 1970s, demonstrates that they have the lowest teenage rates of cannabis use in the European Union.
Isn't that interesting? That is so interesting.
And in Colorado, they found that use amongst kids has actually decreased. So when you remove the taboo and the temptation and the rebellious aspect of using it, the use amongst kids actually goes down.
That is so awesome. Because and then I guess they tried it in West Auckland. You want to get into the dactory a little bit?
Yeah, sure. That's a very interesting part of New Zealand's recent history. A man named Dr. Green, that's the name that he adopted legally, got out of prison after serving a couple of years for production of cannabis. He was so angry at the state for imprisoning him that he resolved while he was in prison to open New Zealand's first cannabis club. And he did exactly that. And I ended up living there for 1 year when I was making this film, and filming the goings on there, and quite interesting police interactions that we had. There were certain policemen that were actually very sympathetic and almost supportive of what was going on there, because they understood that there wasn't really anything harmful happening there. And in actual fact, a lot of the problems of West Auckland with regards to the tinny houses, that's the New Zealand equivalent of a drug house. I'm not sure what you call them in the US. Not exactly a crack house, but where you can get illicit drugs. A lot of those problems decreased because people were gravitating towards the dactory, which was a semi-official place where people could come and relax and get their weed, instead of going to the tinny houses, which were selling them adulterated weed a lot of the time. Sometimes they were adding methamphetamine to the weed. They were recoloring the weed that had been sprayed with herbicides that the police spray on the plants, and it turns the plants blue. But what the gangs in the tinny houses were doing were adding yellow dye to return the green color to the cannabis, and then selling that. People were then smoking this very poisonous cannabis. And so the police realized, well, at the dactory, this isn't happening. And a lot of them came around and said, look, we know what you're doing here, and we're okay with it. we'll actually tell you when we want to come back to visit, just so that you know and you can prepare and you can hide the weed. Then a new wave of cops was sent in after there was a change of government from the Labour government, which happened in 2008, to the national government in 2009. There seemed to be a shift, and then all of the sympathetic cops in the area were relocated, and they sent in some hard noses to crack down on the place. And they raided about 18 times, actually, and put Dr. Green in prison, which is where he currently is, serving a 2.5-year sentence.
That is just it's just a tragedy. It really is. And so I obviously think that he's, they're going to come back with a vengeance in a positive way. I don't think the anger and revenge is necessarily going to fuel his next moves, but it'll be very interesting to see what his name is. Dr. Is that correct?
Yeah, D-A-K-T-A, Dr. Green.
Yeah, Dr. Green. So it'll be very interesting to see what he does when he gets out, and how he will maneuver around them, keeping a close eye on him, obviously. So, and now speaking of sympathetic police force and the hypocrisy that goes on there, one of the first things in your documentary that you explore is that New Zealand is a very alcohol-saturated country, and a lot of the luring of college students to university is advertised by, say, a beer company or whatever. It's kind of synchronistic, I think, or I think synchronistic is close. Synergy, etc. And so I was watching this very, very interesting thing. So in 2009, I believe that was the year of this particular riot that happened. And it was happening simultaneously as like a get-together for cannabis smokers. And yes. So, yeah, if you want to tell about that, that'd be very interesting for the listeners to hear.
Well, Dunedin, which is the town where the riot took place, has actually got a tradition of rioting by students who are drunk. Where they really tear the town apart, set things on fire, cars, couches, telephone poles, trees. In the movie, you'll see them rip a tree out of the ground and drag it through the streets and dump it on a fire that's burning in the middle of the street. What happens is the students get together en masse, thousands of them, drink in the streets to the point where they are aggressively violent. The police get drawn in. They attack the police. Then they have to bring in riot squads. The year that we were there filming, there must have been 120 to 150 police in full riot gear, attacking, being attacked by the students and then counter-attacking the students. There were 80 arrests on one night, and the riots took place over 2 nights. The following night, there was a few more arrests, less than the first night, but it was basically a street battle of drunk students versus riot police. And just a few blocks away, there was the Otago Normal student body's 6th birthday party, where there was maybe 100 or so people smoking cannabis, and the atmosphere was very jovial and peaceful. And the contradiction between these two gatherings is very obvious in the film, where you see the police arrive at the stoners party, and they're engaged with in a very civil way, and the stoners are just chatting with the police, and eventually the police realize there's nothing for them to do there, even though there are people breaking the law, and they just leave, and the same policemen are called to the riot just a few blocks away, where they're having bottles thrown at them by this throng of angry students. So it basically juxtaposes the harms and the effects of these two drugs perfectly. It was just a gift from the documentary gods that these two events took place on the same night in such close proximity.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was hoping that all was your footage, and how fortunate, even though there was, issues going on at the alcohol riots thing, which of course brings to light the resources that were called and spent on, fighting this, supposedly acceptable and legal, well, it is legal, but supposedly acceptable, drug of sorts, alcohol. And how much of the country's or the city's resources were, there's money, there's time, there's energy, there's injury, all that happening, destruction of property, it just goes on, and it's unfortunate that seems to be swept under the rug. And a big component, a big proponent of alcohol being acceptable and cannabis not being acceptable is a gem of an individual named Peter Dunn.
Mm-hmm. The Associate Minister of Health.
Yeah.
In New Zealand.
What a gem.
Well, Peter Dunn is I think one of the world's biggest hypocrites, because he's been taking donations from the tobacco industry, from the gambling industry, from the alcohol industry, and probably from the pharmaceutical industry, although I don't have proof about that, but certainly alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, which are three of New Zealand's most detrimental vices. Mm-hmm. And every time there's a vote in Parliament to curb the ability of the tobacco and alcohol and gambling industries to profit from their vices, Peter Dunn stands up in their defense. And every time there's a vote in Parliament to relax the cannabis laws, to make it easier for people to access medicinal cannabis in particular, Peter Dunn cheerleads the opposition. And his son is actually the guy who he gave the very lucrative contract to draft New Zealand's synthetic cannabis laws, and he is now the legal consultant to the legal highs industry. Which is just another aspect of his hypocrisy, because the so-called legal highs are far more deadly and far more harmful than natural cannabis. So he's created this demand for legal highs by legalizing them. He's recently retracted the laws, which means that now the industry that he's created has been driven underground. New Zealand has a very big problem with synthetic cannabis, although I should point out that what is referred to as synthetic cannabis is often not cannabis, synthetic or otherwise at all. It's just a concoction of essentially research drugs that have been sprayed onto some smokable plant matter, and you really have no idea what it is that you're consuming when you smoke these research chemicals. And there have been deaths related to this. I think there's been 4 deaths so far. What happened was he kept the natural cannabis industry underground and kept the prosecutions and the repression of that side of it. He kept that up, and he created the legal highs industry, which has created all kinds of problems, including a lot of presentations in hospitals of people who have lost their minds. They've completely flipped out, and they've presented with psychiatric problems, some of which are irreversible.
Wow. And it would obviously serve the idea that cannabis is bad for you for anyone who wants to maneuver or manipulate that data. Obviously, it's and how horrible that these people are, ending up with terrible outcomes after smoking what they think is going to be some type of legal natural substitute for marijuana, and indeed it's not. It's a synthetic test ground, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, exactly.
Really?
And it's the entire problem that has arisen in the last 5 to 8 years would be completely obviated by legalizing natural cannabis, which doesn't have this dangerous profile, and it's fairly understood what it is that you're ingesting when you smoke or eat or vaporize cannabis, compared to these chemical adulterated substitutes, which when they were available in shops in New Zealand, there was no listing of the ingredients or the components that went into manufacturing these products. It wasn't required by law for the manufacturers to stipulate what was in them. And when they occasionally did, it was some complex chemical formula that the average person will have no understanding of what that thing is. Even if they go on the internet, they're not going to be able to discover what some of these things are. So it was basically a free-for-all for several years there, and a lot of people got very rich, and now those people have moved their industry underground, and they're importing their substrates from China and from other countries, and cooking it up illegally and distributing it through the tinny houses.
Wow. That's bad.
Oh yeah, it is bad. It is bad. I mean, synthetic cannabis substitutes are not synthetic cannabis. They are synthetic cannabis is fairly safe. Nobody has ever died from actual synthetic cannabis, but from the so-called synthetic cannabis, there are recorded deaths.
Wow. I want to take this over to, since we're talking about synthetic drugs, etc. I kind of want to jump over to pharmaceuticals for a minute and talk about that, because the three legal drugs, the three legal drugs, obviously that are nationally legal for the most part, I think, is alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, which is of course a whole, that's a very loose term for a whole range of different, class A's, class B's, class C's, whatever they are, just harmful things. So the pharmaceutical industry, along with the oil industry, the paper industry, a few other industries that you had mentioned earlier, the pharmaceutical industry obviously is not interested in legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis. Now, I know we have some recreational states that are now happening here in the United States, but we're still looking at a globe here. Well, if indeed you are a person who believes in it's a globe. But anyway, internationally, I will say, big pharma is huge. It's absolutely huge everywhere, and what an evil empire that is. So if you wanted to just go into, you had a really informative guy on your, well, a lot of people were very informative, but on your documentary, I don't remember his name right here.
Was it Rick Doblin?
Yeah, it could have been, yes. Yeah. I watched him. So they were talking, maybe he was, about pharmaceuticals and the harm that is caused, and just in general, if you want to elaborate for our listeners, anything that you might have to add.
Sure. Pharmaceuticals are the third leading cause of drug deaths after tobacco, which is number one, and alcohol, which is number two. And if you put it in perspective, the possibility of dying from a pharmaceutical drug due to an overdose or due to some misuse or due to the interactions of combining these drugs is actually very high. Mm-hmm. So things like OxyContin, for example, and all the various brand names that it's sold under, it's a highly addictive drug. And the pharmaceutical companies are actually releasing forms of the pill that they know will create greater addiction problems. And the FDA has approved these pills. So I've actually seen pharmaceutical drug addicts crushing these pills and snorting them the way you'd snort cocaine.
I know a few. I know a few people who do that,
yeah,
yes.
I've also seen these pills being crushed and cooked up in a spoon the way you'd prepare heroin, and being used intravenously, which the pharmaceutical companies can actually prevent. They can create pills that are manufactured in such a way that you cannot use them in these forms. They cannot be crushed and they cannot be dissolved. But instead, they know that these pills are being misused, and they're actually getting FDA approval to sell them on the open market. And in states like Florida, where you've got the pill mills, people can get literally thousands of opioid medications without very much trouble at all, and not only use them themselves, but then become distributors, black market distributors of these things, which are as powerful as heroin. So this is just one of the knock-on effects of the pharmaceutical industry being basically given a license to distribute very, very toxic sometimes and very potent drugs and very addictive drugs.
Wow. Yeah, it's terrible, and it's so profitable. I mean, they own, I believe, I heard a figure on some documentary that I saw recently. It was that 70% of advertising revenues in mainstream media in the United States come from pharmaceutical companies during a non-election year. And I mean, that is just a staggering figure. And then the lobbyists, obviously, that keep the government officials in their pockets. And it's just a terrible mess. So to watch countries such as Portugal, be able to, turn it around when they were, completely, off the charts as far as, drug crime, et cetera, and to make, their society, more, sublime, if you will, on the way to sublime, certainly not anything perfect. But, it's really encouraging. I don't believe that it's because of the good of the people that the United States is starting to, drift over to recreational cannabis use. It's simply because it's very profitable. And one thing I wanted to get into is in your documentary, which you guys, it's Drug Laud, that's DRUGLAWED, druglaud.com. You can get the documentary for $4.20. That's $4.20. So just so you guys know, and I'm here with Arik Reiss. He is the filmmaker and is currently in the process of making Drug Laud 2, which, by the way, kudos to you for being a part of the solution here on this planet. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's see. And also shout out again to Vinny Eastwood, who apparently has a mini documentary on your mutual friend, Dr. Green. So I hope to look at that as well at some point. I did not know he did that. And that was really cool. What a cool guy that is. And I was really happy to see that. Okay. With the, mess, of criminalized cannabis, the amount of money and resources that are spent, not just, if you wanted to get into a little bit of that breakdown, you're looking at families who are suffering because the earner of their income is in jail. I mean, there's so many aspects to the extra money that really does not need to be spent. If you want to get into that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
And diplomats will accept certain conventions or certain aspects of certain conventions when it suits them, and when it doesn't, they just reject them. So it's not like the UN can invade Uruguay and force them to follow any of the conventions that they've signed, and the same goes for any country. So the conventions are used by politicians to, especially in New Zealand, to say, no, we're not going to experiment with our cannabis laws because we are signatories to these international conventions. But the example of Uruguay demonstrates that the conventions can actually be ignored. And when they make, to film the documentary there, the sequel, because they are the first country in the world to fully legalize cannabis on a national scale. So although I mentioned earlier that cannabis is legal in North Korea, they don't actually have a regulatory framework for it. So there's just no laws against it. But in Uruguay, there are laws to structure its production and distribution, and in fact, the government itself is the distributor of cannabis. So it's a very interesting test case for other countries to follow, and they're experiencing very positive results. They're getting revenue from it, which is the main benefit from legalizing it, because currently all of the profits go to the black market. when you regulate it, as they've done in Colorado, there's an enormous boon in terms of the taxes that you can levy on it, and also in terms of employment, because you're you're not creating a new industry. You're basically taking an underground industry and now creating a above ground industry, which has benefits in and of itself.
Excellent. And Uruguay, is that Uruguay? How do I say it correctly?
Either way.
Okay. Uruguay. Well, now, if I'm not mistaken, they stood up against the UN decision. I believe that was done in 61. The UN. Let's see. I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm looking through my notes.
Convention on Narcotic Drugs.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to elaborate a little bit about that? And and Uruguay is the first country to stand up against that and just basically say we're not following that, even though the UN imposed that upon their country. They just stood back and just said we're not doing that. So it's very interesting. It can be done. In other words.
Oh yes, I mean the UN conventions. It seems to be that politicians.
And you are a citizen. I believe you were born in South Africa. Is that correct?
I was born in Israel. I grew up in South Africa, and I recently became a New Zealand citizen.
Wow. So that's so interesting. It is, here's me, Miss American, et cetera. So it's very interesting, to meet you. And so you are, back home for a short while, I guess. Where do you reside, in general when you're not filmmaking, if that ever occurs?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm kind of in a state of flux at the moment. My next destination will be Uruguay, because I want to go there to